what I'm going to talk about is basically a kind of shortened, slightly shortened and slightly updated version of a chapter of in a book that I co-edited with two colleagues from Finland, Sakari Taipale and Terjan Wilska, called Digital Technologies and Generational Identity. And this is basically was a chapter in from that book. It tries to cover, very quickly, 4 themes. First of all, locating changes in later life in broader society. Secondly, locating technology as part of the processes of modernity. Thirdly, looking at how emergent divisions within later life can be mapped onto developments in technology. And finally, addressing the issue of what kind of research questions can arise from consideration of these divisions. So I'm going to start off with a very, very short synopsis about the work that Paul and I have been doing in terms of thinking about later life and the role of the third age as a cultural field, and the way in which later life has become changed in a way that is almost kind of difficult to reconcile with earlier views. But our argument is that later life is different now, that it is much more suffused by being an active cultural field rather than a passive residue of past life, that it possesses its own distinct cultural and economic logic, presaged upon consumption rather than the process of production, and that the final point is that in some ways it's a kind of a vacillation between 2 processes: the aging of youth culture, in other words, the emergence of youth culture and the fact that people who were kind of part of whose adult lives, who entered adulthood, have kind of themselves become middle-aged and grown old and carried with them a generational habit as established during that period of that, quotes, long 60s. And that endemic in that is the rejection of agedness. The rejection of agedness is something, in a sense, that echoes back what, if you like, that early adult population was doing, was rejecting the old, the things of the past, the models of the past, the kind of old-style modern society, in favour of as yet inarticulated, but, if you like, imagined future. And that this cultural field is not one that identifies people. It's not that this person is a third age, this person is some other age. It's a cultural field that people participate in varying degrees. And I think this is very kind of often a misunderstanding of our work. We're not trying to say that there is a category of person. We're saying that there is a cultural field that people participate in varying degrees. And we would argue that technology forms an important subset within those cultural fields. And the other point is that there is a kind of a habitus, to use a kind of Bourdieusian term, associated with the cultural field of the third age. And it's a habitus that is presaged upon consumption, not upon production. It isn't, in a sense, what you do, it's what you buy that defines, if you like, who you are, how your lifestyle is shaped. And as more and more people, if you like, work in service industries, a whole era is going where what you did was what you were. When people would come out en masse from the factory, come in en masse to the factory, on bikes or walking, that whole defining feature, which almost is embodied in Lowry's pictures of the North and all these little stick figures going in and out of the factory. It's a kind of, it's a history. It's looking back, it's sort of modernity viewed in the rearview mirror. And in its place is an emphasis upon the expansion of consumption. And of course, consumption is no longer going to the high street. It's no longer the era of department stores that defined, if you like, that early modernity, when it was really, really modern to go into a department store and see all these wonderful things on display. And now we have online consumption, which requires and mediated by developments in technology. But behind that consumerist impetus is an emphasis upon choice. an emphasis upon autonomy, an emphasis upon self-expression, and an emphasis on pleasure. That arguably the technology of modernity 1 was a utilitarian technology to make things. The technology of modernity 2 is a technology to deliver pleasure, whether it's the pleasure of online shopping, watching online pornography, or playing Game Boy. It doesn't matter. The point and the theme behind all of that is that the technology developments, which are immense, are not taking place primarily in the field of production, but in the field of consumption. And they are focused not upon creating, if you like, telephones for people who only want 4 choices. They're about creating a whole vast variety of things that people really want, that people as desiring subjects want, rather than as objects of compassion or care. And that's kind of what the third age is about. I think the other point, so second point, is about technology and society. That it is arguable, it's a passive voice, it is arguable. I would argue that the classic social theorists, the kind of Durkheims and the Webers and the Marxists and so on, did not in a sense give a central role to technology in the development of modernity. It was very much about kind of, you know, systems of mass production and the kind of the rise of industrial capitalism. But the technological developments that were taking place, the engines and the electrification and so on, were perhaps seen as a kind of superstructure. They were certainly not seen as the base for, if you like, the motor of modernity in some ways. And therefore they did not play a large part in how modernity was theorized, modernity 1. And I'm using this Ulrich Beck's distinction that Paul and I used to exhaustion between modernity 1, or if you like, the kind of modernity of the sort of industrial revolution, and modernity 2, which is the kind of the modernity of the late 20th century. And I think it's possible to kind of to see there being 3 phases in this process where technology plays a role. The first one is in fact, the making of the modern, the role that the electrification had. And I've used this period from the 1890s and 1930s because even in the 1930s, most homes did not have electrical power sources. They had lighting, but they didn't have plugs to use fridges. They didn't have plugs to use vacuum cleaners. Not that they didn't exist, but they were not able to penetrate the market because people did not have, if you like, the technological development or the financial resources in order to create, if you like, the powering of what Habermas calls the life world. And therefore, in a sense, what was happening was taking place in the systems world. The electrification, if you like, and the expansion of means of production, factory work and so on, plus the entertainment industry and the role of the cinema and the role of radio and so on. That, if you like, the second phase, the kind of post-war phase, is the massification of modernity, when in a sense all of these features of the modern became part of people's everyday experience. And again, going back to the point about vacuum cleaners and fridges, and to some extent kind of TVs, is that this was the point in which they penetrated the life world. So that having, I mean, the kind of classic example is having your own transistor radio that you could take to your bedroom and listen to popular music in. That actually took you out of, if you like, the space of family space into your own individual space. And this, I kind of loosely call it massification of modernity. And it's like moving beyond modern, where in a sense, what was, if you like, seen as a modern world was no longer seen as, if you like, where the future was. And this shift towards consumption, the increasing liquidity of the life course, and the focus upon lifestyles dominated by consumption. And the idea of hedonic information systems, where what determines take-up is not, if you like, technological simplicity or utilitarian value, is the ease of use and the pleasure that you get from it. And that becomes, if you like, the principal motive. And I think this has relevance in terms of the kind of theme. Just the last point about this is just how black goods and white goods have a very different kind of level of penetration. Taking kind of like up to the kind of present and the kind of Android and iPhones, is the extent to which, if you like, 50% penetration of households. The last figure is taken from an American survey, whereas the other one's taken from UK surveys. But it just illustrates the relative speed of take-up and penetration. If you like, massification, much more massified. But also, because of its massification, it meant that there is no stable position. There is not a point in which you stabilize. I mean, I think we was mentioning about having 7 iPhones, 6 iPhones. I mean, it's just a kind of an illustration. You imagine somebody having 7 televisions or 7 fridges. It's kind of like so different. This brings me on to the halfway point. How this then kind of maps onto divisions within later life and the place of digital diversity and how this fits within this period of what Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid modernity, which Beck calls second modernity, blah, blah, blah. First of all, if you like, kind of modernity was important in securitizing and standardizing the life course. This sort of classic model that there is sort of childhood for education, there is adulthood for work, and there is retirement for old age. And that division, in a sense, was secured by the actions of states. And in a sense, it reached its kind of apogee at the end of after the Second World War and the development of a kind of widespread welfare state, which ensured this securitization and standardization of the life course, of the modern life course. And then comes the 60s. I've called this rather fancifully the return of the repressed, but the point is that identities and positions and social locations emerged as salient, which previously had been ignored. So the standardization and the securitization of the life course was one based upon a kind of white male heterosexual model, the kind of male breadwinner. And that to some extent the life course was organized around that model, which therefore meant that identities that didn't fit that didn't really kind of play a large part in shaping modernity. To take a kind of banal example, is if you look at the earliest forms of welfare in the early 20th century, by and large they were designed for paupers. And paupers were sort of identified as a group of people because they did not earn. They didn't earn enough to be able to save enough, and therefore, in a sense, they became impoverished in old age. So you provided an institution for all these people impoverished because of their lack of earning power, sort of impotent through age. This dividing of the state was then separated in terms of unthinkingly gender. In other words, that in the workhouse you had like a female ward or infirmary and male ward. But it was an unthinking one. It was that the whole point of the structure was not based upon gender. It was based around the production processes. And that meant that, in a sense, in the 60s, you had an awakening that issues of gender, issues of ethnicity, issues of race, and eventually issues of able-bodiedness and issues of sexuality, which had been, if you like, kind of not paid attention to in structuring modernity one, started to assert themselves as being important ways of structuring society and, if you like, organizing not just the life world, but the systems world, so the personal becomes the political, blah, blah. And out of this process is going on this steady expansion of the number of people who are retired. And as the number of people who are retired grew, partly because retirement grew, like the period of life. I mean, and I think to recognize how much of a change that is, just a very minor point, but Paul and I were at a conference in Lapland, and I was talking to some Russian demographers, and they were saying that the issue about changing the pensions, because in, I think it's called the High North, which is like the top bit of Russia, people have 50 as the sort of age of retirement, because people by and large don't reach 55. So to have a few years of retirement, if you move it up to a sort of standard 60 or 65, basically means most people don't have any retirement. So I think that the point, in a sense, is that the expansion of retirement is not just more retired people, but more of this period of life as well. So the social location expands both demographically and also, if you like, kind of institutionally. And with that expansion comes division, diversity, inequality, fragmentation. There's no longer, if you like, two nations in old age, which was the kind of the classic position of the sort of the rich and the poor. but there's a sort of multiplicity of nations divided across multiplicity of criteria. How much, if you like, technology plays a part in that diversification, how much it maps onto that diversification. I think this is just some sort of American data about the kind of rate of take-up of adults aged 65 plus and the kind of adult population. And it illustrates that, if you like, if we want to talk about the old, or this group of people categorized by chronological age, they map pretty much the same pattern that everybody else is mapping. They're adults like everybody else. And so their pattern of take-up is like adults of everywhere else. And therefore, if you like, the diversity of adults in general is reflected in the diversity of this other subcategory of adults we call older people, or whatever we want to call them, but who occupy this social location of later life. So how does this way of thinking then, in a sense, inform thinking about aging studies and technology? I think the first point to make is that there is a fundamental division between those studies which are looking essentially through a third age perspective and see technology and ICT as basically forming part of the cultures of the third age. And then there are those other technologies, which in a sense are technologies addressing the darker sides of aging, the sort of the declines, the impairments, the corporal weaknesses, vulnerabilities, inadequacies, however you want to frame it, of that dark idea and the notion that something must be done. And there always has been this notion something must be done. That kind of Paul and I have called this the moral imperative. But this, that part of what shapes the fourth age is a moral imperative. Something must be done. It's awful that somebody should live like that. It's awful that somebody should be disabled like that. It's awful that should be in such hard conditions as that. Something must be done. And so that the technology that drives, if you like, and is driven by the shadowy imaginings of the fourth age, of course will be imaginary, because in a sense the fourth age is a collective social imaginary. It's not like this person is a fourth ager, they've got a little mark of 4 on their heads, and all those people got 3s on their heads. In terms of the third age, I think that one of the first things is we're moving from digital divides to digital inequalities, or if you prefer, digital diversities. But the point is that that's sort of simple access, no access. Do you have a laptop at home? Yes, no. Or do you own a mobile phone? Yes, no. In a sense, it's like kind of being bypassed, and this is something to do with the rate of change. So that it's much more about kind of like level 2 distinctions in terms of the kind of range of use, types of use, and substitutability, and so on. So I think that in some ways the notion of exploring, if like, the diversity or the inequalities of the third age is also useful to be mapped into looking at patterns of digital inequalities. And this is particularly the case as consumption expands as a kind of an online space, and in parallel shrinks as a kind of high street space. Second is looking at the sort of standard divisions in terms of generation, in terms of educational status, occupational status, and gender, sexuality, and so on, and the extent to which these are mapped onto and are reflected in differential patterns of distinctions at the level 2 area. The third theme, I think, is the notion of the kind of liquidity of age, and the extent to which its liquidity is, in a sense, socially realized or technologically realized through ICT. The notion of how age is performed and represented, how it's denied and rejected within the digital community. And this notion of both specialist websites, for seniors online, or mature dating, or whatever else, and the notion that these provide opportunities for people to present themselves. So seniors online, you present yourself as a senior. What kind of person is this person who's a senior online? Or you go for mature dating. What kind of mature dating are you going in for? It's like dating for grown-ups, or kind of like some other kind of dating. It's kind of open. The point, in a sense, is that this expansion of technology creates the opportunity for age to be performed, in the sense of kind of Butler's sense of the performing of bodily identities. Very, very different is the issue of the fourth age. And here it's this notion of, if you like, people who, ex-users, what happens when people fall out of the internet, can no longer keep up with the internet? What about people who never could engage with the internet? People who, in a sense, are seen as like not able to use technology. And this notion of, if you like, an arc of disengagement, the extent to which it starts off with a matter of, if you like, well, I don't want to do it because I don't like it, it's too difficult or whatever, to the notion of this person can't do it. We need to help them. We need to insert them back in. They've fallen out, plug them back in, you know, with a chip in the head. Why not? That's one theme. And with it is this implicit notion, if you're not connected to this global intelligence, then in a sense you're lacking intelligence. If you're lacking intelligence, you've got a cognitive impairment. Dementia is, for those of you who know where, like DSM-5 is now called major cognitive impairment. Dementia has been wiped out of American psychiatry by a simple act of a new diagnostic and statistical manual. Kind of very interesting. But in its place is cognitive impairment. It's like the scope for having cognitive impairment is so much larger now. And why not see these as kind of connected? It's one kind of thing. Then the other thing is the notion of the really old. The really old, that's what we're really talking about, the really old. Whoever these really old people are, we will find them and we will, in a sense, turn them into some kind of dementia-friendly living residents who kind of will be kind of monitored on the screen, a bit like a sort of a, how I imagine it's like kind of people going into somewhere like Kew Gardens and being issued with a little button and it's going to come 6 o'clock. Where is everybody? And like little buttons light up all over and then the kind of the dogs come out. The notion of social robotics is kind of fascinating thing. Once upon a time, human beings were made into machines in the factory. And the more machine-like they were, the more productive they were. Now, in a sense, we're trying to make machines turn into humans. So, Prime Minister Abe in Japan had this 2025 strategy. And part of the 2025 strategy was like scenarios, one of which was like a kind of comic. And in the comic was this account of this family. 2 elderly people, one of whom, of course, had dementia. How else would we know they're elderly? And there were 2 kind of middle-aged people who kind of went out to work, but the woman didn't really work as hard as the man and not as long the hours, but still she was so busy she couldn't bother looking after the children. And then there were 2 children. And there was the robot. And what did the robot do? The robot helped the elderly parent with dementia. It helped look after the kids so that, in a sense, the middle-aged woman and future generation of middle-aged women could have more children, because of course the problem for Japan is that they're kind of running out of reproductive capital. It's not just, if you like, it's aging, but it's also kind of shrinking. And the shrinking is not just because of age, it's because people are choosing not to have kids. So you have this notion of a massive investment in inhuman care. Not non-human, inhuman care, because it's by machines. And machines will be care workers. And finally, is the sort of the extended living, the robo-serve machines, who will kind of like maybe replace the fourth age. We won't have any fourth age, we won't have anything bad. We'll just have people in exoskeletons walked around demonstrating this act and agency that Brunel University, I think, kind of encourages us all to believe that this is how we actually live. So these are some of the possibilities. Thank you very much.